Just Imagine, a new podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, my name is Martin Ballard. I hope you're well. Welcome to the second episode of a brand new series of podcasts from Imagine Theatre. In each episode, we'll take you behind the scenes of one of the UK's biggest producer of pantomime and children's theatre. You'll meet the people who make the company tick, as well as some of the stars who appear in Imagine Theatre's shows every year.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, in episode 1, we met Imagine Theatre's managing director, Steve Bowden. In this episode, I'll be talking to the Scottish actor, writer and director who's appeared in everything on television from Coronation Street and Brookside to Citizen Khan and Doctor Who. But he's also a pantomime writer, director and a fabulous dame. He is, of course, Eric Potts. How are you, Eric?
Hello, Martin. I'm well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. It's been a funny old year, and we'll get to talk about that in a moment's time. But let's start by talking about you. And where did you first get bitten by the theatre bug?
Well, we had a really good drama department up at my secondary school up in Scotland. I was born and bred on the west coast of Scotland in a town called Irvine. And we had a great drama department. The teacher there was really enthusiastic and great at pushing particular pupils forward. She got me into the National Youth Theatre, or got me to audition for the National Youth Theatre. Went down to London 3 summers, had a wonderful time down there, taking part in their project. And so I suppose that's kind of where it started. But even when I was aiming to move on to my tertiary education, I was all set to go and study law at Glasgow University. I had the place and I had here's a word you don't hear anymore, I had the grant. And I was all set to go and do that. I just thought, I'm going to spend the rest of my life saying, what if? So Glasgow University kindly put their place on the LLB, on the law course, on hold for a year. I auditioned for a few drama colleges and managed to get into Bristol Old Vic, and I just thought, no, this was kind of meant to be, and off I went, thankfully.
Well, we'll talk about your incredible career in a moment's time, and with that in mind, you can have no regrets as to changing from Glasgow to Bristol Old Vic. But in the early days, just as an aside, what's your first recollection of panto? Did you go as a child?
Yeah, we used to go from primary school, go to our nearest kind of big town, which was Ayr, and we go to what I didn't find out until later years was actually an amateur panto at the converted church, which became the Civic Theatre, and I loved it. But I had 2 great fears as a child of that age. I hated the tipping seats because I was convinced I would fall through them. It's not an issue these days. And I hated fire. I was terrified of fire. And of course, one year they did an illusion with the metal pan, and they opened it and there was a flame there, and it absolutely terrified me. So that was my first experience of panto, which I did enjoy despite my concerns. As I got older, we used to make annual trips to both the Gaiety Theatre in Ayr, which is a wonderful little venue still there, and the King's in Glasgow, which was iconic panto with Stanley Baxter, Ricky Fulton, Una McLean, all these wonderful names of Scottish variety. So yeah, I had a strong upbringing of visiting panto.
Oh, it's interesting as well. Next episode, we're going to be talking to another Scot, Jane McMurtry, and I think it's interesting to talk about, there can be differences between panto in England and panto in Scotland. Sometimes in Scotland, it can be a little bit more abrasive, can't it?
It can be. I think that's just part of perhaps the style, and it is very much based in the Scottish variety circuit, which of course was hugely strong for many years. It was the annual cycle of employment for these entertainers. They do a long summer season in Dunoon or Rothesay or Largs, and then a few social clubs to fill them over to panto, and then the other side of panto a little break and ready for the summer season. So it was very much based in that. It's very local. I remember chatting to lovely Les Dennis, who's a friend who went up to do panto. I can't believe it was Edinburgh or Glasgow, but he said he didn't have a great time because he was from south of the border, and I'm sure he'd do a great job. He's wonderful in panto, but it's a very local ownership of the shows up there.
And a quick word for Stanley Baxter as well, because, you know, when people make a list of the best dames of all time or favourite dames of all time, of course, he was made for Panto, and Panto probably influenced a lot of the stuff he did on television in his mimicry and his characters, didn't it?
Yeah, very much so. He loved to don the frocks, and he had some wonderful creations made for him. And obviously that became a significant part of his television spectaculars as well. And he had a real style and quality. And he managed to bridge what I consider two different aspects of daming, which is the character dame, a la Les Dawson, very much character-led, and the glamour dame, along the lines of Danny LaRue or modern equivalent Kerry Dupre or Chris Hayward up at Newcastle Theatre Royal, who, you know, don the frocks beautifully and look utterly glamorous. Stanley Baxter, I think, perhaps alongside John Inman, one of the very few well-known dames who were able to bridge that gap between the two aspects of daming.
To date, you've had incredibly successful careers both on stage and on the screen, but your very first job, straight out of drama school, I think, was with Theatre of Poland, wasn't it?
It was a very dark, very deep play about Saint Maximilian Kolbe, who had been a Polish priest who had been incarcerated in Auschwitz and had taken someone else's place to die and had been canonized. So it was a deep play, and I played the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hoss, not Rudolf Hess, Rudolf Hoss. So it was kind of deep and meaningful. We toured around Polish communities all over the UK, and there's a very large Polish community on the Isle of Man, and we went over for a week and played various different venues around the Isle of Man, and we met someone there one night and had to have a translator because her English wasn't great, who had actually been on the parade ground in Auschwitz when the incident with Maximilian Kolbe had occurred, and could remember it, and then obviously followed his canonization. I think that was a deeply moving moment. But then from there I went on to rep at the Coliseum Theatre in Oldham. I think I've done about 26, 27 different productions there over the years. So I was very lucky. Obviously there were gaps, same as every young jobbing actor, but I think I was somehow slightly luckier than most in that I was able. There always seemed to be something for me to pick up. All sorts of rep work across the UK, and like you say, in the early days, bits and bobs of telly. My first telly role was actually in Coronation Street, strangely enough, for one episode as Julie Goodyear's lawyer when her character Bet was going to get divorced from Alec Gilroy, wonderful Roy Barraclough.
First of many in Coronation Street, but that was only 2 years after coming out of drama school. That was incredible, wasn't it?
Yeah, my agent, I managed to get a really good agent from drama school who sent me off for a general meeting with James Bain, who was then the casting director up at Granada, just to, you know, get my foot through the door, as it were. And then I think it was about 3 weeks later they offered me this part, so it was great. It was only one episode, but it was a lovely little part, and I was very much awestruck, of course. You know, it was wonderful.
How many characters have you played? Because a lot of people don't realise that actors can slip in and out of soaps on a regular basis, playing different people. How many did you play?
Diggory, who was the last and the longest. I did 2 years as Diggory. He was the fifth. He was the fifth character. So I was that first one, a solicitor. I then played a consultant for Jack Duckworth when he fell off a horse. I played an electoral officer when Audrey was trying to get elected as mayor of Weatherfield, and a couple of others. So yeah, all the other ones were for 1 or 2 episodes. Diggory I did a couple of years, but I've also done a couple in Emmerdale as well. 2 different parts in Emmerdale so far.
And of course Mr. Moore in Brookside.
Despite the fact I was living not a huge number of miles away along the M62 in Manchester by that point, I never thought I would be in a Liverpool-based soap. So it was a great surprise, and again, a great learning curve as well.
Now here's the thing, I don't think there could be more polar opposite aspects of performance, could there? From the extravagant, larger-than-life pantomime characters you create on stage to the more intimate performance in front of a small studio and a television camera. It's a totally different discipline, isn't it?
It really is. You've got to sort of think what size your proscenium is, and you know, in these beautiful theatres that we are lucky enough to perform in, it's great. You've got to fill not only that space but the auditorium space in front of it. And then on television, you've got, I think, you know, these days slightly larger, so you're going up to maybe like 60, 70 inches. That's your proscenium. So you've got to tone the performance down. And that took a little while to learn on my part. I think I remember one of my first days filming on Brookside. The director that had cast me came up to me after a scene and took me just to one side, went, "Eric, love, it's not the Theatre Royal Hanley, bring it down a bit." And I still remember that, and it's very true. It's just about doing less and reaching not as far.
When was the first panto that you performed in?
It was a good few years after I left college. I'd done a few Christmas shows, but actual trad panto as we would know it, I think, if I remember correctly, was around about, oh crikey, 1990, 1991. I was on tour with a show, and the other venue in Nottingham, the Playhouse, was run by one Kenneth Allen Taylor, who was a great director and who had come into Bristol Old Vic and done sort of mock auditions for us students in our final year. So I literally dropped him a line, which I left at the Playhouse stage door, saying, "I don't know if you remember me, but you gave me quite good feedback at an audition at Bristol Old Vic. I'm just wondering if there's anything in panto, because I finished this tour end of August, and literally the next day my agent messaged me and said, "Oh, you've been offered Baron Hardup in Cinderella at Nottingham Playhouse," which was just absolutely wonderful. And I had 3 thoroughly enjoyable years at the Playhouse playing the old man parts, as you do when you're a 24-year-old actor, of course. So I really enjoyed playing Baron Hardup and Alderman Fitzwarren. And then the 4th year, with my time with Kenneth Allen Taylor, I was offered either stay at Nottingham or go to Oldham Coliseum, which he had taken over the reins of for the second time in his career. And he said, you can play Dame in Oldham. And I thought, oh yes, I'd love to have a go at Dame. And I'd spent 3 years watching him daming at Nottingham, and thoroughly enjoyed soaking up all the techniques and styles and tricks that he used. So yeah, my first Dame was sort of 4 years into my panto career, but first one was at Nottingham Playhouse. Great fun.
And of course, Kenneth Allen Taylor was one of the dames, one of the longest-running, more traditional rep dames that directed, wrote, and then starred in the panto himself. And he nurtured so much talent as well. Susie McKenna, for instance, who directs at Hackney these days, was principal boy there for a few years alongside him. And it's a great training ground, rep panto, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And like I say, being part of that team was a real honour, and just soaking up what was going on round about me. As you say, Martin, Kenneth was a wonderful teacher, even if he didn't mean to be, but just watching him perform, but also direct, and his writing was a huge, wonderful foundation for me to move forward from. My own style, but certainly there's a lot of the basis of what I do now comes from things that I learned during those first 3 years watching Kenneth doing. And this is why I think it's very important, one of the many reasons we must hold on to these rep theatres. They're vital to the arts in this country.
Of course, in recent years as well, you've written and directed panto, so you've had a busy calendar year in, year out, television, directing theatre generally, appearing on stage in panto and other shows as well. And then all of a sudden, March 2020, it all goes pear-shaped because COVID-19 literally changes everything for everybody. How have you had to adapt?
Yeah, it's just bizarre. So after the initial shock, I was 2 weeks into an 11-week national tour of a play. We literally got the first 3 venues done, and we left the theatre going, well, we'll maybe see you on next Tuesday, or we maybe won't, and of course sadly we didn't. So after the initial shock, and we're thinking, okay, well, we could possibly pick up the tail end of the tour in a few weeks to that going, and then the tour originally being rescheduled for the spring, and then that went, so it's been rescheduled for the autumn ahead, which we hope will now happen with the vaccination rollout and everything occurring now. But you suddenly think, oh right, well actually what am I going to do? And like you say, I was very lucky. I still had some writing commissions to do, some for our wonderful friends at Imagine Theatre. So I pushed on with those. I was writing 4 scripts for them, which we believed were going to happen last Christmas. None of which did, sadly. But I had the writing still to do, so I pushed on with those. Because initially, when we all went into the first lockdown, I think we did genuinely believe it was only perhaps going to be a few months at most. We were all going to be back out and back to some kind of normality by last summer, which just didn't happen. So I was lucky with that. I had a couple of other writing commissions, a new musical. I was writing a script and some lyrics for that, which is again going into production in the autumn. So I was busy with writing. I was still able to do a couple of radio drama jobs. But then, of course, as it became more apparent that this was going to be slightly more long-term and slightly more serious than we had originally thought, then you have to find other ways of kind of maintaining an income.
Eventually, some support did come financially from the government, but freelancers have had a particularly torrid time, haven't they?
Yes, it's been really awful. Not just in our business, self-employed, like you say, freelancers have, I think, been particularly poorly treated. And I'm not going to detract from what the government have done. It's certainly the very minimum that needed to have been done. But for example, at the moment, we find ourselves in a situation where we are having to make 80% of 3 months' money last 5 months. And there's absolutely no response from the government about any kind of dealing with that situation, no matter there's petitions going around and all sorts. And it's just being ignored. And you think, well, hang on, all the people that are being furloughed correctly and rightly so are not losing 2 months' money. We are desperate to get back out there and earn for ourselves, provide for our families, provide for ourselves. But we can't. We just really can't. So why in heaven's name are we suffering financially when, to be honest, I think we are going to be very much needed and very much valued once we get back to the phrase, of course, at the moment is the new normal. Once we reach that, I think the arts is going to be vital, as indeed it has been digitally during the lockdown. So it's about dealing with financial pressures, and I've been very lucky in that having had a busy career before then, I've had a certain amount of money that I could fall back on and use. But I know a lot of my dear friends who haven't, and a lot of them have gone out and are working, stacking the shelves at Tesco's, or they're delivering stuff or whatever. They are paying the bills as they can, but it's not been very well handled, I don't think, for the freelancers. And we missed out on a couple of months' money last year. We're having to do so again at the moment. The logic just beggars belief, I think.
In terms of Panto, hopefully we're keeping our fingers crossed that it will be back next Christmas. In what form, who knows at this stage. But the other thing we haven't talked about is your dame, because we talked about Stanley Baxter, didn't we, earlier on? You've actually played, believe it or not, you may not know this if you're listening to this, Eric played Les Dawson in, well, you can tell us the story behind that. It was a Sissy and Ada production, wasn't it, really? The two characters that he and Roy Barraclough invented. But who influenced you as a dame?
People like Les Dawson. So I'm very much a character-led dame. I always say that if my dame were to stand at the front door of the theatre at the end of the show, all the kids should want to give her a hug.
Yeah.
Not me, but her. They should feel safe. They should feel warm. They should feel enchanted by her. She should be their third granny. So there is that real accessibility. So I think people like Les Dawson, again, I brought up on Scottish dames, wonderful Scottish dames like Stanley, like Ricky Fulton, who's perhaps slightly less known, but again, a wonderful performer. Johnny Beattie, who did the Gaiety Theatre in Ayr, who we lost just last year, was a great Scottish variety performer. So again, all those kind of motherly like dames, I find that they were really appealing. Terry Scott, John Inman, I'm trying to think of names that people would know who followed that same pattern. It's very much, if you go far enough back, have a Google on YouTube or whatever, you can find images of a wonderful performer called Norman Evans,
yes,
who did a whole series of sketches called Over the Garden Wall, where he pretends to be a woman, northern woman, having a natter with someone over the garden wall. And it's very much that feel, that recognition comedy, as I call it. Everyone should look at my dame and go, oh, we know who she is. Doesn't she remind you of Auntie so-and-so? Or isn't that like the woman from number 24? There's got to be a recognition factor to her that endears her, even if it's with eye rolling.
Yeah, and absolutely. Rather like the tradition of panto itself, Les Dawson talked with great fondness of what he learnt from Norman Evans, and now you're talking about what you learned from Les Dawson. Those traditions get passed on. You've got a couple of daughters, haven't you? Have either of those chosen a theatrical profession?
Well, Hannah, my eldest, she trained as an opera singer up at the Conservatoire in Glasgow and started that career. And then, of course, as anyone who's had 5 years opera training, she then went off and became a ring mistress in a touring circus for a year. That was money well spent. She then decided to kind of diverge from the traditional opera, which she still did, but into acting as well. She did a few pantos. She, in her first year working for the company First Family Entertainment, she played Fairy in Stoke-on-Trent at the beautiful Regent Theatre, and she won the Panto Award, Great British Panto Award for Best Fairy. I wasn't bitter about it at all. I'm still obviously waiting to win anything, but that's neither here nor there. So she's done very well. But during lockdown, she's made best use of time, and she has retrained as a hairdresser. So she's been great. I've been getting free haircuts for the past years. It's been wonderful. So yeah, she's done that. My youngest daughter is an employment law specialist. She went through university and avoided the lure of showbiz, so she's got a proper job.
And just going back briefly to Sissy and Ada, hysterical rectomy, how difficult was that? Because we've talked about characters on TV, we've talked about characters larger than life in panto, but when you're actually reproducing a character created by another actor, Les Dawson, how difficult was that?
It was a fascinating process, and it was a really great play. It was beautifully written by a chap called Graham Warrener, who I'm still in touch with. Myself playing Les, and Steve Nallon, who's best known for playing Margaret Thatcher in the Spitting Image, original Spitting Image series. Among other things, of course, he was playing Roy Barraclough as Sissy. It was a balance, because I didn't just want to try and do an impersonation of Les, but he, with being such a wordsmith, such a word-based comic, he had a real specific speech pattern, which I thought, well, if I latch onto that pattern rather than perhaps the exact vocal tone, then that would be accepted. People would know who I was without thinking, oh, that's not a very good impersonation, is it? We did a 3-week run at the Broadway Theatre in Barking, rather bizarrely, but it went really well. I think the producer was the resident director at the theatre there. And then we did the national tour. We played many venues across the country. We came to the Lowry in Salford, beautiful theatre. And just a quick indulgent tale, at the opening night there, we did a week there or so. At the opening night there, Les Dawson's daughter from his first marriage to Meg came to see the show with her children. And part of the show's content, as well as these wonderful Sissy and Ada sketches, followed the announcement that Meg had been diagnosed with cancer, and subsequently she went on to die of cancer. So having the daughter of Les and Meg in the audience was quite significant. And after the show, she came up and she just said, I just want to thank you for bringing my father back to me for 2 hours, which I thought was hugely kind. And she introduced me to her children as sort of young teens. And she said I told them to close their eyes and listen, because that was their granddad speaking. And it just absolutely blew me away, because I hadn't intended to do an impersonation of Les. But again, it was just his very specific, his patterns of speaking and his accents of certain words that just went through the whole narrative of the piece. And you immediately think, oh, I recognise that. And it was another great learning curve. I always think you should come out of any job having learned something. So it was great. And we're hoping, again, once we get out of the pandemic, that there is the possibility of another airing for the show, but I won't say too much more about it.
How fantastic. I'd urge anybody to go and see that. I never saw Les as a dame. I wish I had, but he was such an incredible performer, not just for the mother-in-law jokes, but for everything. He was an incredible wordsmith as well, wasn't he? So if you get a chance to go and see this with Eric, then do so. It's a real treat, I'm sure. Okay, let's finish with 3 quick-fire final questions, Eric, because I want to know, first of all, what's your favourite panto title?
Well, I'm going to be indulgent as ever, and if you allow me, I'm going to have 2. One, purely for selfish reasons, is Mother Goose, in that it's the only real panto title that is totally centred around the dame. But sadly, it's done fewer times these days, I think mainly because Disney hasn't worked its magic with it, so that theatres, it doesn't sell as well. But it's a great story for a dame, because you are kind of the centre of attention, which is a bit indulgent. But from the point of view of my sort of more broadly accessible panto, Dick Whittington is great. I have a real belief that all panto should be based on an adventure story, and then you hang the routines, the comedy, the music, the special effects onto that adventure. But at the heart of this story is a real adventure that will make the kids hold on to the seat in front of them and actually care enough to shout out. And Dick Whittington is a great adventure story. And I also love the fact that it is loosely based on a real character and a real setup with, the King Rat and his plague of rats infesting London. So yeah, Dick Whittington is probably my choice.
Second quickfire question. When was it not all right on the night? When did something go wrong? Have you got any favourite bloopers or, funny moments?
Yeah, well, I did one of the many shows that I did at the wonderful Coliseum Theatre in Oldham was an old farce called Love's a Luxury, which actually is very funny, and it still holds up, but it's quite a dated piece. And there was one point in the play, it's not panto of course, but broad strokes comedy, where I had to reach for a blunderbuss gun on the wall above the fireplace, and this was in the middle of Act 2, and I turned around to reach for this gun and it hadn't been set. It just wasn't there. And it was kind of and we hadn't noticed at all during a whole of Act 1 and the first half of Act 2 with the interval. No one had actually thought, oh, the gun's not on the wall. If it had been just a piece of set, that's fine. But it actually was hugely pivotal to the rest of the play. So I went, I'll show you. You just wait. Yes. You just wait there. I'm going to get something. And off I went, gesticulating madly in the wings, going, where's the gun? So I suppose that, I think, is one of my favourite moments. And coming back on stage and being surrounded by just a load of quivering actors who couldn't actually say a word because they were trying to suppress their laughter.
And because you're such an old pro, nobody in the audience realised anything was wrong.
Exactly.
Just one final thought when it comes to panto. Why is panto so special, do you think? And what does panto mean to you?
I think we have to value its traditions and in many ways its purpose. I always think the people that are actually buying the tickets for panto are doing so because they want their children or their grandchildren to have the same experience as they themselves had 25, 50, 60 years previously, whatever. And I think if you try and be too clever with panto, you lose its main enchantment. We have to compete with the consoles that the kids are holding and playing with for the other 364 days of the year. So it must be visually exciting. But I think if we were to lose any of those wonderful traditional elements of panto, you do so at your peril, because people, I think audience members, parents, spend half the time watching the stage and half the time watching the children they've brought to make sure that they are having the same experience as we ourselves remember having when we were their age. And I think it is vital that we hold on to that. It is one of the very few genres of entertainment these days that still sustains 2 shows a day for several weeks. Sadly, everything else is, really just 1 show a night these days, and it does so for a reason. So we must value what it is. We must, always try and contemporize it, but without losing its wonderful traditions.
Is there anything better for you than, going out centre stage in front of a full house with the audience in the palm of your hand for a panto?
Oh, it's a wonderful experience. And I'll tell you why, because the people that you are staring at, that wonderful full house, be it 200 in the Village Hall or 2,000 at the Liverpool Empire or the Bristol Hippodrome, wherever, those people are the final members of the cast. Without them, you don't have a panto. Without their responses, without their support, without their integration into the show, there is no show. And I also I love occasionally, then I stand at the side and have a little peek, as much as my terrible eyes will allow, out to the audience, and seeing children being allowed to be children again for a couple of hours and actually caring and booing and cheering is wonderful. I think it allows children of all ages to be children again, and it's got to be worth it so much in these days.
I'll tell you what, somewhere at some time in the next day, weeks, months, you're probably popping up all over the place on television in repeats of everything from Casualty to Emmerdale and many, many others. But in the future, what can we look out for? Have you got any other TV projects or anything coming up?
Telly, no, nothing scheduled. I've got, as I say, the tour that we are hoping to pick up in the autumn is called By the Waters of Liverpool, play set just before Second World War, and is a great piece of theatre. Then Panto still to be confirmed, and then there's some stuff next year, very embryonic. But I did a wonderful online read-through of The Merry Wives of Windsor a couple of weeks ago that they are hoping to develop into a production which actually could be quite exciting. So yeah, there's things happening. Telly is always, as you know, Martin, always going to cast very late. So it'd be great, hopefully, to get back on the box and do a bit of that. It's a very different style, but always enjoyable.
Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up, Eric. We'll keep our fingers crossed that we're all back this Christmas, and I'll look out for you on tour and in any other future adventures that you might have. But in the meantime, thank you so much for talking to us today.
A real pleasure, Martin. It's great to be doing this and to be part of what I call Team Imagine. They're a great and vital part of entertainment in this country.
Well, that's about it from me, Martin Ballard. Until the next time on Just Imagine, the new podcast series from Imagine Theatre. Don't forget to subscribe now through your favourite podcast app, because next time I'll be chatting to another Scot, the choreographer and performer who's appeared in everything from Mary Poppins to Gypsy in the West End and choreographed shows like The Bodyguard on stage to The Voice on television. Join me next time on Just Imagine when I'll be talking to Jane McMurtry.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.